Coming up on this episode of DevelopSec, we discuss security flaws as defects and embedded versus built-in security. Tackling the challenge to integrate security into the development process? Looking for insights, answers, and practical solutions to avoid getting overwhelmed? Welcome to DevelopSec Live, where our focus is your success in securing and improving development processes. And here is your host, James Jardine. Hey everyone, welcome to this episode. Today I want to talk about security flaws as defects. Now I saw this on a LinkedIn group. I happened to see somebody post a question asking about should security flaws be considered defects? And it was really kind of a general question, but then there was lots of conversation going on after that of, yes it should, no it shouldn't. And what seems like a very simple answer that, well, yes, they're defects. And, I'm willing to say that, yes, they're defects. There's a lot of more complexity that surrounds this than just being able to say, yeah, they're the same as defects. I mean, they are a subclass, I guess you could say, of a defect. If you look at an application that has a simple logic flaw where calculations are off. So maybe there's a banking application that does some calculations to determine the amount in your account, and the logic behind that actually has issues with the calculations, and so we have wrong values in there. That's a critical flaw within that application based on its business needs, but may not be considered a security flaw. Maybe it is because it's reducing the amount or increasing the amount of money flowing back and forth, but typically that's a flaw that would be found through a normal QA process, reported back, right? We have that ability already built in to identify certain types of defects, report them, triage them, fix them, retest them, and get them through. Well, that's similar to what we're doing with security flaws. It's just that oftentimes we're finding these through different groups, through different tools. So we look at them as it's something different. It's not the same as a normal defect. But I would say that in most cases, there's really no difference there. I mean, it's the same thing. It's a defect within your system. But like I said, I think there's some complexities there that make it a little bit different. We treat them differently, and there's some reasons why we do that. But first, there are some similarities. They are bugs. So they are found through testing. We find them, we identify them, we analyze the risk to them, just like any other bug. So bug, defect, security flaw, put them all in the same bucket. We do the same things with these issues. Once we identify them, we prioritize them. We then bring back and find out which ones we're going to fix in the next release. We fix them, we retest them, we release them. So it's a pretty standard process for how we go about dealing with issues within our code base. And this has been going on for a long time. It's not like bugs are something new in applications, and certainly not just because now we have security bugs out there, that this is something completely new that we have to worry about. But there are also a lot of differences that we have to think about, and this is where the complexity becomes the issue, because when we talk about security, right now most organizations, pretty much all organizations, have a group or certain individuals that are designated with that security title. So you've got CISOs, you got CSOs, you got a whole bunch of different upper level management people that have this responsibility of making sure that the organization understands the risk, the security implications, and hopefully helping reduce that risk. And they're taking on a lot of this responsibility to say, yes, we're secure, or we know to what level we are secure at. So if they don't have insight into the security issues within our applications, then they don't have the information they need to make proper decisions and proper recommendations throughout the organization on that risk level. Well, if you go back to how we traditionally store or deal with defects within our code, that's usually handled by the QA group. We have a defect tracking system, so all the bugs get logged in there, and then they get triaged and passed through and they get worked through. Well, a lot of those bugs may not make that much difference as far as a security risk level or a privacy risk level, to the organizational side that's dealing with security. So that information all just jumbled into one can sometimes be a problem. So that then turns to, well, let's use a different system for this. So could you imagine if you've got 15 different calendars with all kinds of different appointments set on them, and there's no way to actually pull them all into one application? We're lucky enough today, on my iPhone, I've got 5 different calendars in there, but it's all on one calendar. It's all in one spot. I can see it. I can change them. It all syncs beautifully, and it works really well. But what if that wasn't the case? What if I had to go to each calendar individually and go look at it and find out, hey, what do I have for an appointment today? What do I have for a task today, to be able to figure out what I'm trying to do? We know this would be difficult, and we'd stop looking at certain calendars. It would make it really difficult to deal with getting all the tasks done, and it's very unmanageable. Well, that's a lot of times what we see in the organization, because we have this roadblock of security needs insight into this subset of information. And so to get insight into that subset of information, we then create our own tracking systems, or we use tracking systems of all the different tools that we have out there. So now I've got all these different tracking systems that I'm trying to combine all these things from and bring them down into our area to understand them, interpret them, but then also at the same time bring them over into the developer area and the QA area, so that way they can also see what we have going on and be able to triage those bugs and work through them. Well, this can be very difficult, as you can imagine. And now you've got multiple people tracking multiple different types of flaws within the systems. And this causes issues, because this is where things fall through the cracks, or this is where you become the annoying guy or gal that are sending over these emails saying, hey, when are you going to fix this bug? When are you going to fix this bug? We have these processes in place to fix bugs, and yet we've created another process around this to say, no, these ones are special, so somebody else is going to track these. And sometimes I've seen it, it's Excel spreadsheets that we're trying to track these all down, and we're sending emails all around saying, hey, what do we have for this? What do we have for that? But if you go take a step back and see, wait a minute, we already have bug tracking systems in most organizations. If you don't, you should have one. We already have these. So why not find a way to be able to track everything in the bug tracking system that we're already using, that we already have processes around, but then find a way to denote certain items as security flaws. So that way we can have separate reporting for that if we need it. And that's what we need. We need separate reporting to be able to pull out and say, I just need security flaws, so I can send that over to the security group so they can see what we're looking at as far as risk within the organization. I don't want to send them everything, because again, now they're getting jumbled with a whole bunch of information. But I do want to make sure that I can denote these out, that they can go and see these, so they have that insight that they're looking for. Because when you have all these disparate systems, and you've got, this DAS scanner over here that does that, and this SAS scanner over here that's doing this, you're trying to pull all these things together. Then you got to try to weed through them and say, well, which ones are valid, which ones are not valid? Do we accept the rating, the risk rating that the tool is giving us, or do we want to modify that so that way it actually lines up with how we really feel that risk is within our organization? And we'll talk more on another episode talking about analyzing the results of all the different testing that we have in place, because that's a whole topic within itself. But for this one, I really want to focus on how we treat the vulnerabilities, or how we treat these bugs as they come back, and see if there's ways that when you look at your organization, look at your workflows, how can we meld these together a bit so they all kind of flow similarly? Because the more paths we have, the more confusing it gets, and that's when things start kind of dropping through the holes, right? They start falling out, and next thing you know, something gets missed and it hasn't happened. And then we say, hey, well, why didn't this happen? And if you listen to episode 3 last week, when we talked about coding standards and having separate secure coding standards, and an ISO only portal that sits out here that nobody knows exists, or maybe they're told once a year it exists, or nobody's looking at it, same type of thing, right? When we start building these same things up in multiple spots, we start to see that breakdown, and then we start to see things missed. So we have to start from an application security aspect, digging more deep into working with what does the current development processes look like. So many places want to jump in and say, hey, here's how you should develop software. Well, we're already developing software. We know how to develop software. We need to figure out how to build these pieces that you have some knowledge about into what we're currently doing, so that way we're improving those processes and moving forward. So would it make sense to have QA doing security testing? I believe yes. I'm actually doing training right now for QA groups to teach them how to do security testing and understand a lot of the general concepts around security issues and security flaws. So that way they can actually start testing for some of these things. And once they start testing for these, they're going to start showing up in the normal bug tracking systems. They're going to fall into that normal bug tracking workflow that already exists. So there's less chance of it falling through the cracks and saying, oh, I don't know what happened to that flaw. It fell through. Now, I know you're going to say, everybody argues that, well, if security doesn't have involvement in this, then the security issues will just get ignored. They'll get pushed down because nobody wants to fix them, and they're not that serious. And so they'll downplay them and they'll put them to the side. I'm not saying security still doesn't have insight into this. They still have insight into this. The idea is that you've now got QA testing this, is following the same workflow. We've tagged these as, hey, this is a security flaw. Systems oftentimes can be updated, so we can put a tag on there. This is security related. Now, how can I take that and still get that information over to the security group so that way they can see, hey, we've got these flaws. Let's bring you in. Let's figure out how we can make sure that we fully understand the risk of these things so that we can prioritize them properly. But the actual finding and retesting, if I found it through testing and I understand what it is, I can retest it to verify that we've properly fixed it and then sent it on through. So it follows that same normal process. The only difference is because it has a security denotation on it, then we're going to bring security in if we need it and say, hey, here's what we have. What do you think of the risk on this? How do we handle this to make sure that we have it properly prioritized and that we're meeting whatever guidelines have been required so that if it comes back as a high, we know we have a certain amount of time to resolve this issue. And then we fall back into our normal workflow and we continue on as normal. The positive to this is that not only are we following the same workflow, but now the people that are doing the testing, and as these flaws are getting prioritized and assessed, they already know what type of release cycles we're on. They know where we are in the release cycles. Usually your QA group has a pretty good idea of where you are about when the next release is. What are they going to get tested by that release? So we're already part of that. We know what's going on versus you have an outside group that's not aware of any of that stuff. And so they're reaching in and they're saying, hey, I've got this flaw. When are you going to fix this? When are you going to fix this? When are you going to fix this? But they don't have any idea about what your release cycles look like. So they're sending back info. Well, we have a release on this day. And then how many times does that release never actually happen? Or, oh, that didn't get put in that release, right? We still have all those same issues, but now we've got it between two groups that are trying to bounce back and forth and try to stay on top of each other. And this can cause a bit of an issue because, again, this is where things are falling down through the cracks. Because, I mentioned at the very beginning talking about, embedding security in versus bolting security on. This is part of that conversation. How are you bolting that security on versus embedding it in? If you've got people doing web app pen testing, and that's all they do is app pen testing within your organization, where are they reporting up through? Is there a reason why they're not part of the QA group testing that way? Are you using them to help the QA group start to learn how to do some of these tests, to build this in? So that way we've got everything flowing through the same processes. Your testers, and that's not, downplaying anybody's ability or anything like that. I know most security testers do not want to be considered QA, But let's look at it for what it is. You're a QA function. You are testing software for defects. So that's what you do. We already have these things in place. We've had lots of conversations about this over the past few years, talking about this is what we're doing. We're testing apps. So why are we trying to do everything so different? We treat everything so different. How can we start building that in? And depending on how your QA groups are set up, that might not work, embedding those testers into the QA groups. If they don't cover the whole organization, it just depends on how you're doing that. But in many organizations, if you can move them into that area and say, look, you're part of this team. Now, maybe you don't work exactly the same way as the rest of the QA because they're designated one app or a few apps, and maybe you cover a lot more than that. The overall goal is you're still doing the same thing. You're now part of those release cycles. You're aware of what's going on to make sure that all that stuff is covered and we're not making things fall through the cracks. And you've got that security expertise to know, hey, this is worth this. This is the severity of how this could be played out. So we need to make sure that the priorities are set straight and we're handling it properly. And usually QA, the one that finds it, they're the ones that solve it. Now, there's some other caveats to when we're dealing with security bugs and the reporting and all that stuff. Now, those that listen to my podcast, they know I'm a pretty big proponent of the idea that, a lot of these tools should not be in application security's hand. They should actually be in, the developer's hands, the QA group's hands. They should be the ones responsible for running these tools. If you look at static analysis, the whole point of static analysis is to be able to scan your code, identify your bugs for you, and then you can immediately get that feedback and resolve those issues before your code proceeds on. And we've had things doing static analysis, not from a security standpoint, but we've had static analysis for a long time. Dealing with in .NET, we've got FXCop, right? There's all kinds of tools that let us do static analysis. The developers run those. We don't have some other group out there that runs static analysis tools against our code bases. Oftentimes they go right in our IDE, we run them, and we're good to go, right? We deal with it right then, and we move forward. And then comes security scanners. And all of a sudden, security scanners, static analysis is the example, not much different than what FXCop was doing. It's analyzing our code. It's determining, hey, what type of flaws do you have? And what's the priority of those? And here's some recommendations, but we need to resolve these. And yet we have other groups that run these, and we run them later on. Now with DevOps, we see it actually running more. We're starting to build into our continuous integration these static analysis tools so they're run on certain builds. Maybe they run nightly. We're seeing more of these being run, and some of them you can even run right from your desktop so the developer can run it before they even check their code in to be able to see, hey, have I introduced any of these flaws? Now what does that mean? I have to go back and I resolve these before they get up into QA. And then you talk about getting into QA. Now we're talking about dynamic analysis tools. Again, QA probably has tools to automate the testing of certain types of functions. So that is what dynamic analysis does. It automates the testing of functionality within your application. Now, it's not automating whether I put a 2 in the box and another 2 in the box, and if it's supposed to add the 2, that it comes to 4. But it's automating the ability to send in different malicious type of attacks and see if they're coming back as the app is vulnerable. But we're still doing the same thing. It's still the same process. We're running these tools. They're giving us feedback. We take that information and we create defects out of it into our system. And we feed that back into the loop, back down to the development team and say, hey, here's what we have. Here's the priority. We need to work on this stuff. But the big argument usually is, well, wait a minute, though. These people won't understand the output of these tools. They won't understand them. They don't have the skill set to be able to run these tools, and I argue against that all day long, every day. Now, I will agree that if you are going in and you are tweaking these tools and customizing them and writing custom scripts inside of them, a lot of people may not have the skill set offhand to be able to go in and do that. They may not have the time to go in and do that if you don't have people dedicated to that portion of the tool. But if you're not doing that, if you just are saying, hey, I've got this tool, we're going to run it custom out of the box, we'll take the results, we'll deal with them that way, anybody on those teams can learn to analyze those results, just like the person that you have over in security that learned to analyze those results can learn to get those and pull them in and keep them in that same workflow. And if they have questions, if there's something that's higher level or more technical than they understand, then they can reach out to that security group and say, hey, we've got an issue here. We're not really sure what this means. Can you help us with that? But by taking this information and pushing it over and saying, look, you guys are already doing tools. Let's do these tools as well. And picking the right tools is a whole nother conversation. But making sure we pick the right tools to put in there, then that frees up that other side, that application security team, to be doing more things that are more valuable to the organization. Maybe that has to do with assessing the actual results that come back. Oftentimes we take the results, we just stick them in a bug tracker and we say, hey, go work these. We don't actually analyze the results. Another conversation also that we're going to have on another episode of this, talking about analyzing the results. But what if we could actually analyze those and dig deeper into what those results mean versus I'm missing output encoding on this one line of code. So all this stuff feeds back around, but if we can build it in, then we're going to be in a much better place than as we keep things separated out. And so that's what we want to think about when we think about, is a security flaw a defect? Simple answer is yes, it's a defect. But it's more complex than that because we have to have information feeding over into other departments because they're making generalized decisions based on that information. And if they don't have that information, they're not going to be able to make those decisions accurately. And we don't want to run into that situation because as an organization, we need to understand the risk level of the entire organization. And our applications are a piece of that. They're oftentimes a big piece of that because they're our gateway to most of our sensitive information. So yes, they're defects. I personally think, yes, you should be tracking them all in the same spot. You already have trackers, but denote them in a certain way. So that way you can still pull reports on them so you can see what's going on with those defects. And that may require a little bit of analysis to make sure it happens. Whether you're using TFS or whether you're using some other bug tracking system, is there a way I can denote these items a certain way so that way we can pull separate reports on them? And then we can feed those reports over to the security group so that way they have the information they need, that when they're going up their chain to be able to report on the security of the organization, they have the right information they need to be able to do this. But also remember that as we're trying to embed this stuff into our existing groups, whether it's SAST into development, whether it's the secure coding guidelines that should be just coding guidelines into development, or DAST into QA, or getting QA even manually testing for some of the security flaws out there, right? These are all steps to help us embed this where it's going to be the closest, right? Where we're actually starting to do what we've been saying we want to do for a long time, which is build security into our products versus bolting it on. And so this will help free up some of that time that the people that are trying to do this as a bolt-on, so they can actually focus on building better technologies to be able to help identify, so building internal tools to do some of this stuff, whatever it is, internal training to help QA or development understand the flaws or the coding standards that they're following to make sure everything's there, doing code reviews. All these things can now be added into, hey, here's what you get to help with, versus just running tools and taking the results and then just bugging people to say, hey, when are you going to have this ready? I know I've been in that role where that was my job, take the output of tools and say, hey, go bug the developers and say, when are they going to have this released? And I want, and you have to keep a separate spreadsheet. It is really a hassle because we as security didn't really have access into the TFS system, but that's where all the bugs were stored. And that can be a problem. So I recommend to anybody out there, as you're dealing with bugs and defects and you're thinking about security flaws as defects, try to build as much of this into the same processes you already have in place. And then whatever gaps are left over, and in this case, a lot of the gap is reporting, figure out how you can solve that gap, but still keep everything going as it's been going. So again, here, if we can put a tag on it that says this is a security flag, so we can pull this out and pull it into reporting. If that's our only gap, Well, then that's an easy gap to solve in most cases. Let's solve that, and then we can have everything kind of going in one spot. This isn't something that's going to happen overnight. It's going to take time, but in the long run, it's less people you have to try to bring in to specialize in doing something that you already have people in the organization that are trained really to do. They just need a little bit more training to understand this portion of it. So hopefully this information is helpful. I know sometimes it's controversial. A lot of my opinions I find are. But, trying to break the mold on what are we constantly trying to do over and over that doesn't seem to be making a huge impact. How can we do things differently, and how can we do things that seem like they are more aligned in the right way to actually embed this in where it'll actually get traction and start bringing through? But we need the help of both the security side and we need the help of the development side. And that's everybody on the development side. That's the whole IT side. Business analysts, developers, QAs, project managers, the IT managers that oversee the whole process. Everybody needs to be on board with the idea that if we start doing some of these things, we'll actually start seeing better security come out, better applications come out, and the organization as a whole will be more secure. There is no 100% secure, but we'll be more secure, and we can at least say we feel good about the work that we're doing because we know we're taking the proper steps to get this stuff through. So thanks for listening to this episode, and any feedback, send it to us, james@developsec.com, or hit us up at DevelopSec on Twitter, and follow us on the YouTube channel as, we do this hopefully every Wednesday at 10 a.m. Thanks a lot for listening.